Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and today I'm going to be talking to you about the books that I recently read. Here they are. I have three of them and I'm only going to talk about two of them, and that is because the first one I have here, Great Expectations. I did a live book discussion with my friend Alex and with my channel members and whoever else wanted to join us. This was the book club pick that I did in the month of October and November, and we discussed it at length there. I will leave the video for that linked in the description box below if you want to hear my thoughts on Great Expectations. Talk about it at length, include my rating, and all the things. That leaves the other two books that I have to discuss. One of them is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is the first work that I've read by Ursula K. Le Guin, and I have a couple of different thoughts about it. Now, if you have been watching my videos and you saw the video I put out last Saturday, you will know that I actually lost this book in the middle of reading it. To be less dramatic, I should say that I misplaced it, which is highly unusual for me, especially while I'm still reading a book. And I did think I had lost it. I did eventually find it, but not until after I had ended up getting the audiobook and finishing the book with that. And I think one of the reasons that all of that ended up happening was because as the book went on, my interest in it went down. And I was not expecting that to happen. This is a book that I'm reading thanks to my local sci-fi book club that I'm in, and I'm looking forward to discussing this book with them. However, let me tell you a little bit more about what it's about. This is a work of science fiction, which makes sense given that I'm reading it for that sci-fi fantasy book club. And this is listed as both sci-fi and fantasy. I'm not really sure why. It definitely leans more towards sci-fi in my opinion. But it was published in 1974 and follows the story of Shevik, who is a really well-known and famous physicist who lives on the planet Inaris, which is a planet that is isolationist and anarchist, and he is going to visit the neighboring planet of Eurus, which has a very different government. It actually has multiple governments on it, but the main government that it's known for is definitely the more capitalist society. And this book is all about governing and governments, identity, beliefs, perspective, and walls, and all sorts of walls. The walls that separate us, the walls that bring us together, the walls that we put up to keep ourselves isolated from those we see as others. And that was a reoccurring motif that I really enjoyed in this book. The highs in here for me were definitely the writing style. This was a really well-written novel. It definitely impressed me and made me open to reading more of Ursula K. Le Guin's writing. And I really liked the ideas that she brought up in here. I liked the way she used that reoccurring motif of a wall to talk about all manners of things throughout the entire book. I liked the way that she talked about the government systems and that she wasn't going to really call one positive and one negative, but kind of showed how different forms of government have their pros and cons and how they may also not be quite what we think. And yeah, those were some really great moments in the book for me. However, my least favorite part of this book had to do with the plotting. I actually didn't like multiple aspects of the plotting. I thought the pacing of the book was slow and just got slower and slower as the book went on. I also didn't like the sequencing and structure of the book. The book alternated chapters between Shevik's earlier life on the planet Anaris and currently what was happening in his life on the planet Yaris. And it kind of makes sense that it did that, but in this book particularly, I just felt like they were too far apart, which I feel like kind of fits the theme of the book, but I mean it not in a good way. I did not like the going back and forth. I did not find his earlier life quite as interesting, even though I saw what purpose it was serving in the book. I think just that section of the book went on for way too long, and I would have almost rather started with a shorter prologue, but that's not what happened in this book, and therefore I think the way it was done it just ended up making the book and all the plots, meanings, and thoughts and idea drag out in a really like just frustrating sense. And I think that's why I put the book down at one point and just lost track of it, kind of forgot about it. Eventually picked it back up because I did want to finish it for my book club that I'm going to be attending, I think, next week. Though I'll be honest, if I wasn't reading this for a book club pick, it would have been really tempting to DNF it. The other thing that I found frustrating about the plot was I did feel like that when she did bring up certain ideas, there also seemed to be some sort of weird pressure to move on from that plot point. And so I was feeling like it was taking too long to get to some parts of the plot that I wanted developed. And then once we got there, we just very quickly moved on to something else. And so the parts of the book that interested me the most, I felt like she spent the least time on once it reached like a climactic moment. And that was kind of frustrating. I feel like this is a book that I would have a really hard time identifying the climax of, and I don't feel like that should be necessary or is called for in this book. I feel like the climax of the story could have happened in a much more obvious way and should have been much more engaging. I don't know. Is it because I finished it on audiobook? I don't think so, because I'm pretty sure I was already feeling like that before I lost the book and started it on audio. So we'll see what other people in the book club think. It's always a good discussion. I love talking about books with other people. So if you've read this book and you have thoughts on it, whether they're similar to mine or different, feel free to comment below. I would love to talk with you about this. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars, and I'm rather disappointed by that. The next book I read was a much different ride in a lot of ways, and that was My Brilliant Career by Miles Franklin. I buddy read this with Britta Bowler, and we had a fun time reading this and discussing this. This is a book that was published in 1901. It's a work of fiction that feels like auto fiction and to some extent is. Miles Franklin is a really well-known Australian writer. In fact, there is a prize named after her. And she wrote this book at the age of 17, basically just to amuse her friends with a bit of a romance novel, if you will. And I think if I had have known that going into this book, one, I'm not sure I would have picked it up and read it. Two, I may have felt differently about the book, but maybe not. Let me tell you what this book is about. This book follows the early sort of teenage years of Sabella Melvin, and she is living in the 1980s in rural Australia. She is young, opinionated, poor, and wants her mind to be fed and enriched by everything the world has to offer. And as far as she can tell, the only way out is the way up, like up through the classes and to gain some wealth so that she can get education in the things that she just feels like she needs and wants. She is living a really hard, heavy labor, child labor type of life with her not very successful farming family, and when opportunity strikes and comes knocking, she takes quite the advantage of it. This book discusses life in rural Australia. It talks about class differences, the day to day life of both the poor or working class in rural Australia, as well as the sort of wealthy upper class landowners, especially the upper class landowners, I would say. And there's also quite a bit of romance in this book, which for whatever reason I was not anticipating. The best part of this book, hands down, is the narrator voice. The book is narrated in the first person by Sabella, and she is quite the character and has quite the narrative voice, and that comes across so strongly. I cannot recommend enough listening to this on audiobook. It was so well done and just so entertaining that even though there were aspects of the book that frustrated me, it was still fun to listen to and just to sort of hear what was going on. There is quite a bit of humor in here, and it really was an entertaining story that got told. So in that sense, I think Miles Franklin did a really good job. However, I did experience, and so did Britta, a very negative part of this book, which is we had seen that people said that the narrator of the book, Sabella, was fairly whiny, and initially that was not how I felt about her character. However, as the book went on, she did start to feel more and more vapid, and more whiny, and kind of felt like everything she said at the start of the book were the things she wanted, and that she wasn't just trying to escape poverty just because she didn't like to work, didn't seem to hold up to be true as the book went on. There was definitely a rapid descent into frivolity And she definitely became very absorbed in her better lifestyle. And the whole concept of her wanting to be fed more just seemed to disappear. And so for me, the part of this book that I didn't like quite as much is that I had a lot of high hopes for her at the beginning of the book, and the opening chapter or two really set me up to want to be rooting for her. And by the end, I was like, really? Is this all that we're going to talk about? Is this all this book is about? So that was a little disappointing. I can say if you like books that have romance in them, or, any type of like friendship or enemies to lovers type of situation, if you like the relationships, the male female relationships that are in Anne of Green Gables, you may actually enjoy what I feel like is the main part of this story. To say that she wrote this book as a romance to entertain her friends, I think that is really true and the main thing to get out of this book. I don't tend to read a lot of books that are solely romance novels, so I may be like, poo pooing on an otherwise good story. I also had a very different impression about what this book was about, partially based on the back of this book. So, Penguin Classics, I blame you. Anyway, I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. It was almost a 4, and I think now knowing what she intended the book to be for, I would have to say that it probably, for most people who like that type of literature, would probably give this a 4 or higher. I think for me, it just not being my favorite type and having different expectations, even based on the opening chapters of the book, that's where it lost the half a point and ended up at 3.5 stars. Okay, that is it. The 3 books that I have, really the 2 books that I have to talk about, and this seems like not a lot for me. I did not finish these all in one week. I've actually been reading Great Expectations, or had been reading Great Expectations for a couple of weeks. The Dispossessed actually took me an absurdly long amount of time to finish, and this book was probably the one that took the least amount of time. Not that any of that matters because it's not like it's a race, but I thought I'd just mention it. So that's it. My next Saturday video will be me wrapping up everything that I read and didn't read in all my sets for the month of November, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!